I think amongst all of the people that believed that the universe was eternal, Christians actually stood out. The Judeo-Christians actually always held, no, the universe had a beginning, because that's what it says in Genesis.
Hello and welcome to The Way. I'm Wendy Grace. On today's episode, we're going to be grappling with one of those big questions, which is, are science and faith in conflict with one another? Or is the opposite actually true, that they can complement one another? Well, to help us through this discussion, I have joined with me in studio Dr. Peter Taylor. Now, Peter is a professor at the Centre for Astrophysics and Relativity in DCU in their School of Mathematical Sciences there. He has a Master's in Theoretical Physics from Cambridge University and also became a Marie Curie Research Fellow at Cornell University in New York. So definitely well placed to have this discussion. Peter, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Let's start with that big question, because obviously you have been, working in the field of sciences for many, many years. This is something that I think is probably misguided often, where people think, well, if you say I'm a Christian, then you must be anti-science. Are they in conflict with each other?
No, they're not in conflict with each other at all. I think probably the big fallacy here that people fall into is confusing what we sometimes say is a mechanistic explanation for some particular phenomena versus an agency explanation. So
okay, you got to give that one to me in plain English.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'll explain. So, if you consider the universe as a whole and you want to try to understand it, you want to try to explain how it is and why it is the way it is. There's two different views you can look at it, two different perspectives you can take. One is really just asking the how type of questions. That's mechanistic. And how is laws of nature.
Yeah.
Those kinds of.
How does gravity work?
Yes, exactly. How does gravity work? How do balls fall? How do planets orbit the sun, etc., etc. The actual how. What are the equations of motion, for example? Whereas there's another perspective you can take, which is really a why type of question, and it's really to do with first causes, or what we say is agency. And faith questions usually have to do with agency explanations. So, for example, when you look at the scriptures of the Christian faith, for example, they are all to do with agency. It's really about who is the prime mover, what is the first cause, what is the ultimate fact. It's not really about the mechanistic explanation. It's not usually about, well, how did the world come into existence, or how do stars form? It's not asking or answering those types of questions. And so you can hold both of these two explanations side by side. To give you a quick analogy, I could make a cup of tea for my wife. This is a straightforward analogy. And we could talk about the mechanistic explanation for making that cup of tea, and it would be thermodynamic. It would be me boiling the water. It would be increasing kinetic energy of the water molecules and increasing the temperature of the water to boiling point. Right? That would be the mechanistic explanation, but it doesn't come anywhere close to the agency explanation. Why did I make the cup of tea? That's a completely separate question. That's not even in the provenance of science. And the agency explanation might be, well, I love my wife and I want to show her an act of kindness. So they're two completely different perspectives on that same phenomenon. And the other thing I would say is it doesn't surprise me that people hold that view, because when you look historically at how faith evolved and how science evolved, if you go back far enough, you have a situation where people attributed everything to the gods, right? To the meddling deities, from the having the next batch of crops to, the stars in orbit. And because so many of the things that people did once attribute to the divine, as in attributed mechanistically to the divine, came to be understood more exactly in terms of science, people came to view these two things as competing ideas for the same thing. Yeah. And so it doesn't surprise me that people have gone on that journey and they look back at history and they might be tempted to extrapolate and say, because this has happened in the past, eventually everything will be explained by science, Right, but that's a very different statement. Now you're really making a metaphysical claim there. You're no longer really even making a scientific claim. And I think that's kind of what's happened, at least in the Western world, particularly since the Enlightenment. This idea has been embedded in our culture now.
But yet some of the greatest scientific minds in history would have been believers.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, there's a long list of them. Yeah, we could talk about Francis Bacon, for example, the father of the modern scientific method. He was very much a devout believer. You could talk about people like Isaac Newton, arguably the greatest scientist of all time. A really, really brilliant scientist. There was basically no aspect of science or mathematics in his day that he didn't greatly influence. And his most famous work is a work called Principia. And to him, he writes that he'd hoped that would lead considered men to a belief in a deity. I mean, he's literally being explicit about his faith in that statement. I mean, there's many more greats we could talk about. We could talk about Boyle, yeah, an Irishman. People out there might know Boyle's Law, that they might have learned that in school. He's considered the father of modern chemistry, another very devout believer. He actually financed the first printing of the Bible in Irish.
Wow.
In the 17th century. Like really brilliant man. We've people like Lemaitre, Catholic priest. He was the first person to hypothesize that the universe began with a what we now call a Big Bang. So another really great believer. So yeah, there's lots of people out there.
And that's one of the things I remember striking me once and I want to encourage people listening or watching that God wants us to be intellectually curious. You know, it's not blind faith. And that simple phrase of the Big Bang didn't bang itself. In other words, this idea of cause and effect. So what was the cause?
Yes, yeah, and that's getting back to that prime mover idea, and that's really what the Christian faith, for example, is getting at. In the first book of the Christian scriptures, a book called Genesis, and the first chapter there is really getting at establishing God as the prime mover or the ultimate fact. It's not as concerned with the mechanistic explanations and the details, though. I think it's a little bit unfortunate that sometimes maybe we try to extract science out of those texts when that's not their intention. The intention is really just to communicate who the prime mover is, what the ultimate fact is. So yeah, I can completely agree, and I think it's a little bit unfortunate maybe that some of these things have kind of got lost.
Is it, and also that you're kind of seen sometimes from a Christian perspective of, well, it's not reasonable to hold this belief, but when you actually stand back and say, well, how reasonable is it to think that this is all just an accident when you think how fine-tuned the universe is?
Yeah, and I don't like that claim that faith is unreasonable. And well, I'm here speaking and advocating for Christian faith in particular. And in the Christian text, for example, there's many calls to reason about your faith. Does that famous scripture that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen, and there's two words there that stand out: substance and evidence. And so it is really about reasoning, and it is about is there substance for this? Is there evidence for this? And even if you think back to the very first gospel messages in the New Testament of the Christian text, all of those early disciples of Jesus were actually trying to communicate evidence. In those days it wasn't scientific evidence, but it's the same principle. What they were trying to communicate was evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, for example. And they really were trying to bring people along that journey of evidence. They were trying to say to people, look, this faith that we proclaim is reasonable because we have eyewitnesses as evidence that this person was raised to life. And so, in these days when we talk about these things, it's usually more about scientific or historical perspectives, but it's really the same principle. It's trying to bring people along that journey of evidence. And I think we have lots of positive evidence for belief.
What's the most compelling, do you think?
Oh, good question. I think there's two I always come back to. One is the cosmological Big Bang. and the second is the fine-tuning argument. Now, I can explain those to you in a little bit more detail. So the cosmological Big Bang is basically the statement that the universe began to exist. Now, for most of history, this would have been a completely controversial claim. I mean, most people throughout history believe that the universe existed forever. And
How is that possible?
well, they just believe that the universe always existed.
Yeah.
It was an eternal universe. And even people of faith, many people of different types of faith would have believed this. They would have just believed that, in some sense we associate the divine with the eternal, and we believe that the divine and the world are in some sense entwined, so it's not unreasonable to believe the universe is eternal. And we didn't really have any scientific evidence either way. And I think amongst all of the people that believed that the universe was eternal, Christians actually stood out. The Judeo-Christians actually always held, no, the universe had a beginning, because that's what it says in Genesis. And like I said, there was no evidence either way until the early 20th century. And going back to that great priest Lemaitre and another scientist, astronomer called Hubble, they observed that the galaxies are receding away from each other. And in fact, the further away they are, the quicker they're receding away from each other. And the implication of that not everybody quite realized was that means the universe is expanding. This was the first evidence that the universe is expanding. And so at least the universe isn't static. So that much we knew. And then people started to think, well, actually it was Lemaitre who actually first made this hypothesis. He thought about rewinding the clock. Well, if the universe is expanding now and you move the clock in the other direction, doesn't that mean in the past
Where was it? Yeah.
It's contracting? And what's the end point of that contraction? And he called that the primeval atom of the universe, which we now call it the Big Bang, but it was literally the first idea of the Big Bang was there already with Lemaitre. And then this was later confirmed. So Lemaitre also had this great insight that, well, if the universe did start with this primeval atom, there should be some leftover radiation. And he was thinking of it in terms of gamma rays. That's not quite what we found, but there was some leftover radiation that we did find, which was found accidentally by two scientists in the 60s, Penzias and Wilson. They later won the Nobel Prize for it. And this leftover radiation, which we call the CMB radiation, that was actually confirmation of the Big Bang model. So this was real concrete evidence that the universe began to exist, not that it existed forever.
But something had to cause it to begin in the first place.
And that's exactly where it goes then, is you come up with something which is now called the Kalam cosmological argument in philosophy. And it goes like this. So I'll give it to you in
plain speak.
I'll give it to you as a logical argument. So the first premise is everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Right? That sounds fairly obvious, right? And it's a metaphysical axiom. You can't prove it, but it seems very reasonable. In fact, it seems almost obvious, I would say, that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The second premise is, well, the universe began to exist. That's also very reasonable. I would say it's even more than reasonable because that's what the evidence suggests. Now, we don't prove it, but the evidence suggests that the universe began to exist. And most cosmologists speak like the universe had a beginning. All right, so everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. And then the logical conclusion is the universe must have had a cause.
And we call that cause God.
And we call that cause
And then
God.
following on from that, how unlikely or likely is it that all of the perfect conditions needed for human life to exist, or life to exist, the first, most simplest form of life, the unreasonable argument is that, it's so unlikely that it wasn't accident.
Yeah. So that's an argument called the fine-tuning argument. And what scientists and cosmologists in particular have figured out over the last few decades is that the initial conditions that the universe needed to be in order to support life, to support the kind of universe that we live in, are so extraordinarily fine-tuned. It's on a razor thin edge. It's like the most perfect divine tightrope walk you could ever imagine. And the numbers involved are like
What are the numbers?
ridiculous.
You can't even put this too many zeros.
I'm going to tell you the numbers, okay? But it's not going to mean anything to you because you have no reference point for numbers like this. So I'll give you one example. The most extreme example is the fine-tuning of entropy. Now, entropy, in this kind of informal sense, means a measure of disorder, right? So entropy, in some sense, it's about order and organization and disorder. And there's a law that says entropy only ever increases. So disorder only ever increases. So in other words, when you shake a jigsaw, you imagine a kind of a jigsaw all broken up. When you shake a jigsaw box, you're never accidentally going to open it up and find that the jigsaw just came together.
Yeah.
Just through you shaking it, right? It doesn't, order only ever decreases. So if you take a made jigsaw box and you shake it, it will become more disordered, but you'll never take a jigsaw that's broken up, shake it and open it up to find it complete. So order only ever goes in one direction, on the whole and on the average.
Yeah.
Right, so entropy has been increasing throughout the whole existence of the universe. And we think the universe is about 13.8 or so billion years. So entropy disorder has been increasing for that amount of time. And yet, the universe is so very ordered and organized. Like we have stars and we have life and we have systems that are very, very organized. So
who organized them?
Well, the real point actually is that if disorder has been increasing, the universe is becoming more disordered for 13.8 billion years, and we find it now so orderly, how ordered must it have been at the beginning? It must have been so insanely smooth and ordered at the beginning. Now here's the estimate that cosmologists have come up with, that entropy must be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123.
Okay, so too many zeros, they'd fill the whole room, basically.
No. That's way more zeros than there are atoms in the universe.
Wow.
So we're not talking about atoms in this room. And I don't even mean a little bit more than the number of atoms in the universe. I mean orders. There's about 10 to the 80 atoms in the universe. This is 10 to the power of 10 to the power of. It's a double exponent, 120. I can't even give you a good intuition for what that number means. It's beyond comprehension. I mean even the atheist Sir Fred Hoyle said that a common sense interpretation of the facts of these numbers is that a super intellect monkeyed with physics. And that's coming from an atheist.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's only one example. There's another, 10 or 20 other constants, physical constants, that have to be very, very, very precisely fine-tuned in order for life to exist.
So when you have that and you take those two things, where do you move on from there? Because there's still this block, I think, and I know a lot of research, especially with young people, says that this is a barrier to them, that part of their logical mind and their soul is drawing them towards faith, towards God. Maybe it's more of a cultural pressure, and I'm sure it's like this in the scientific community, that, well, if you believe that, you can't believe this. Mm-hmm. So how do you move on from there when you have that as your basic foundation? Okay, so it's not an accident we're here, something created it.
Yeah.
How do I know that's God?
Yeah, well, as in how do you go from that point to, well, I guess the question, maybe if I could zoom out a little bit, maybe a way to reframe that question is, if I accept the cosmological Big Bang argument and the fine-tuning argument, is there anything I could actually learn about the first cause? Like, there's still a bit of a distance to go from that to, let's say, the God of the Bible, for example, or a personality. So maybe we could think about it in those terms. One way to kind of frame that is, well, to look at the things that did begin to exist. Okay, so the universe began to exist, right? Well, most physicists will say that, well, that's where time and space began. Okay, so you might say, well, that must mean that the first cause is spaceless and maybe timeless. Okay, well, they're kind of classic descriptions of the Judeo-Christian God. God has those qualities in that description.
He just, I am.
Yeah, exactly that, yeah. Then you could kind of think, well, the universe is full of personalities like us, personhoods. Well, therefore, the first cause must be a person in some sense, must have a personality in some sense, must be a personhood in some sense, must be an actual personal being. Well, that's exactly part of the Judea description of God. Well, the universe is immense, so the first cause must be very powerful. The universe is full of laws that we can discover. That must mean that the first cause is a lawgiver in some sense. So I think you actually can bridge the gap between, even just that cosmological argument to getting something that approximates, the Judea description of an actual personal God. Now, it's still quite a distance to get from that, say, for example, to Jesus, because that requires the historicity of the life of Jesus, and we have different evidence for that coming from the historical records, for example.
Could you argue though as well, Peter, that people have that accusation of blind faith, which obviously we're talking about the total opposite of that. But you could say the same of the sciences, or again, it's not to say that they're in conflict with what they're really trying to say. They complement one another, but that in and of itself, if you're not willing to interrogate the two, is a belief. Is it a religion in itself?
Yeah, I think people apply an unfair metric to what are classically seen as faiths, and they don't analyze or scrutinize enough their own assumptions. And I would say, well, first of all knowledge in one way or another starts with some unprovable assumptions. Even mathematics, we call those axioms in mathematics. And to make any progress in any field of knowledge, you have to start with assumptions, unprovable assumptions.
Or you're going on someone else's work that they have, someone else's theory that you're building on.
Even worse than that, I mean fundamentally unprovable assumptions. Like, let me give you an example from mathematics. So we all would have learned junior cert geometry at some point, and
it's buried in here somewhere.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere, and that's also known as Euclid's geometry, and that's built on 5 axioms, unprovable assumptions that you have to make progress.
That we accept.
Yeah. So for an example of one is between any 2 points there exists a unique straight line. Now that seems intuitively obvious. And it seems even empirically obvious, but you can't prove it. It's too fundamental. Like you can't prove it within that system of geometry, is what I mean.
Yeah.
And but the main thing is you use that assumption, and then you build up statements about other things, and then you check, are all of those things consistent? So a decent definition of religion, for example, might be a set of axioms, any set of axioms that underpins your claims to origin, purpose, morality, and destiny. I think that's a very good definition of religion. Yeah. Again, so I'll say it again. It's my working definition of religion is the set of axioms, the set of assumptions that underpin your claim to origin, morality, purpose, and destiny. And if you
can't prove many of that, you can't prove morality or where it comes from or where it's
right. So the point is, you start with a set of assumptions, and then those assumptions will lead to conclusions about those things, and then you have to check whether those conclusions are consistent with each other, consistent with empirical evidence, etc. So in that context, atheism, for example, would be a religion, right? And it's a very good definition of religion. There's no point in tethering the definition of religion to the idea of God, because that's very difficult with pantheism and paganism, which we all accept as religions, but it's very hard to define a God in those contexts. But I think if you think about it as a set of unprovable assumptions that basically underpin your worldview, and by worldview I mean those 4 areas, origin, morality, purpose, and destiny. And when I say that to people, they go, "Oh, does that mean that you can just?" It sounds like I'm being relativist there. It means, well, if there are unprovable assumptions, does that mean you can make up any assumptions and come up with any worldview? That's not at all really what I'm saying, because whatever assumptions that you make, they have to lead to things that are not self-contradictory. And they have to lead to things that are consistent with reality, with empirical evidence. And it turns out that it's actually not that easy to come up with a set of assumptions that explain reality and are not self-contradictory. And my claim is that Christianity is the only worldview that satisfactorily explains origin, morality, purpose, and destiny in a way that is consistent as a whole picture.
Yeah.
And
It brings them all together, but
it
then
brings
you
them all
can
together.
start, as we have, unravel some of the evidences from a science perspective and say,
Exactly.
okay, I can see how there's a bit of a jigsaw going on here in terms of how they can kind of connect with one another.
Yeah, exactly.
I loved the word earlier, Peter, when you were saying it's totally reasonable to be a Christian, to be led in that direction through faith and evidence together. So where have we gone wrong? Why is it that we as Christians are the ones are seen, or those who are curious about faith are seen as the unreasonable?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I don't fully know the answer to it, if I'm being honest. I don't fully know how it has come to be that the Christian faith has come to seem more unreasonable in modern times, when you don't really have to go back that far. I mean, you don't have to go back 100, 200 years, and scientists consider this completely reasonable. And I actually do think a part of it is more public perception than reality, if I'm being honest. For example, there's been some surveys done on the number of scientists who hold on to like a faith in a God, and over time, over decades, and it's remained more or less the same.
So it's just something that you don't talk about.
It's just something we don't talk about, yeah. And I
Yeah.
think it's something to do with public perception. And maybe one of the differences has even been the response over the years. So, you asked this question, I think the number is something like 40%. I don't know exactly what it is. So something like 40% of scientists are actually have some faith in some form of God or another. And you do the survey 50 years ago, and the response is, oh, I'm surprised that it's so few. But you do the same survey today, and people are, well, I'm surprised that it's so many.
Yeah, it's more than you think.
Yeah, so I think somehow the actual perception has changed, the public perception has changed, but I don't see any more fundamental reason, because I think that let me say it like this: there's been no scientific breakthrough or philosophical breakthrough or historical breakthrough in the last 100 years, for example, that has caused the foundations of Christianity to crumble. The same facts are there, but somehow people's perception of these things have changed. And I really do dislike the claim that Christianity is unreasonable.
Is that because of a form of, people might call it scientism, where it's everything has to be reduced to a scientific theory? And even just looking at that from a broad perspective, it's, well,
Yeah.
we can't be reduced to just a scientific theory. This conversation, this place, this time. But there are some who just think, well, that's the only conclusion you can follow knowledge to. But that's very reductionist.
Yeah, and that's a great point. The scientism thing has become so pervasive, and I always when I think about this, I always remember that seeing an interview between James Corden, the comedian and TV host, and John Bishop, the Liverpudlian comedian, and John Bishop was asking James Corden about his faith, and James Corden responded with, because his parents were Christian, so he grew up as a Christian, but he'd kind of walked away from his faith. But his response was, I have a hunch that something might be out there, but you just can't argue with science. And it was so symptomatic of
what does that actually mean?
Pervasive philosophy of scientism that's out there, that first of all, scientific knowledge is more authoritative than all other forms of knowledge, and second of all, that it's in conflict with belief in God, both of which I think are false. And maybe to me, the most amusing part about the claim of scientism that science is the only or most authoritative form of knowledge is that the claim itself is undermined by scientism, because the claim is not a scientific claim.
Yeah.
The claim is a philosophical one.
Rather than a scientific.
Yeah. So it's self-defeating. It's kind of amusingly self-defeating, in fact.
But people can make these kind of throwaway statements and they're just kind of accepted.
Yes, they are. Well, yeah, and it takes a little bit of meditation, of course, to kind of, you have to kind of think about a statement like that before you kind of realize, oh, hang on a minute. Because, when somebody says something like that to you, it seems like a reasonable kind of claim. And until you kind of go, oh, well, let's try apply that claim to the claim itself. And now that claim undermines itself.
Is that where we lack confidence, or sometimes even the knowledge in ourselves, when that's kind of thrown at you, you can freeze and go, oh, I'm not really sure how to answer it. And we feel like we have to be on the defensive with our faith rather than some of the things we talked about going, hang on, this is pretty reasonable.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah. I do think that's part of it. I think as well that oftentimes we're encountering people who've meditated on a particular point that you haven't thought about. And in real time, it's very difficult to really, I think, to really come up with a decent counter argument, or really to even analyze the validity of a complex philosophical statement in real time. You really do have to, most philosophical statements are fairly intricate and complicated, and you have to really meditate on them and think about them. And that's why we have philosophers and theologians and scientists. They think about these things for the
different fields of study, as you say, not just science. Still, though, I'm sure over the years it's been thrown at you lots of times saying, but how do you know there's a God, Dr. Taylor?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And my answer will be, first of all, I find it reasonable from the perspective of the evidence. But then for the Christian, of course, it becomes personal as well, right? Every serious Christian that I've ever met has at some point had something represented to their actual conscious faculty that has made them believe and that think that this was reasonable. And
an experience, you mean?
And an actual experience. Yeah, exactly. And then they tend to have an ongoing journey with that experience that again affirms and confirms over time that the God that they believe in is real. But one of the difficulties with that, of course, is that that reality is a very private reality, and you can explain that to somebody, but
they'll never feel how you felt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of a private reality and a personal experience. But I think if you say, oh, okay, I think if there was one person saying that and making that claim, you might say, well, that's a private reality for you, and there's no really way for anybody else to assess the validity of that. But then when millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, have claimed similar encounters all throughout history.
That in itself not evidence?
And that in itself is evidence, of course it is. It's not scientific evidence, and this comes back to your scientism point. It's not strictly scientific evidence, but it is evidence. And I like what there's a really well-known atheist called Mary Midgley, and she makes this claim that science, and in particular the physical sciences, and I love this phrase she uses, has no private line to reality. And it's just a brilliant line. And I think that's what scientism thinks that's where the scientism goes. It's kind of rooted almost in an arrogance and a sense of pride that we have the monopoly on understanding reality, and we have the private line to reality.
And there's a hierarchy and you're at the top of it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's many forms of knowledge, and experience being one of them, of course. And
is that a problem then, that while it's great to be able to look to the scientific evidence for God and all of the things that we've touched on the one hand, but it can also be a downfall to say, well, you have to be able to prove absolutely everything. And some things, like you can tell me, for example, I really love my wife, and I'll say, okay, prove it. And you might list all the experiences you've had or things you've done, but that's not proof. That's you telling me stories. There's some things that we innately know, love probably being the strongest emotion, but we can't prove it.
Yes.
We just know.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And in fact, even in the context of science has very little to do with proof. People find that statement surprising. Science itself is about gathering evidence for something. It's unless you're doing mathematics, you're not proving anything. Mathematics is the only domain of proof. And so even scientists misuse that word,
So it's theories based on gathering.
Yeah, you build up,
data.
and oftentimes you build up very, very compelling evidence
Yeah.
for a particular theory. But as we know throughout history, scientific theories change, even the ones that looked compelling at one time. And but it's the very same in other domains of knowledge, right? I mean, I have over the history of my lifetime have built up a lot of personal evidence that the God I believe in is real. True encounters that would be some encounters that would be hard to explain to other people, but also just true. It's not. I don't want people to think about it as being mystical either. It's true. I mean, God revealed Himself in the Scriptures through propositional truths that other people can analyze. So it's not just a private reality. That's part of it, and that part of it is hard to share and explain, although it does seem interesting to me that hundreds of millions of people throughout history have had very similar private encounters with God, ones that bear striking resemblance, and ones that are even consistent with accounts we read in the Scriptures. But in the Scriptures themselves are propositional truths that rational minds can meditate on and can think about and can wrestle with.
And I would argue God actually wants us to.
Yeah.
Then the broad question we're asking today, and how would you answer it, is, can science lead us to God? You know, can it be part of that journey where you're standing back and going, there's more to life than this?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll give you my personal story. Because for me, I grew up, and when I was about 6, my mum came to faith. And so I mostly grew up in a Christian home. So I say I was very God conscious, but not necessarily Christian in a strict sense.
It was just kind of there.
Yeah. And I was very conscious of God. I had a strong moral conscience, for example, as a result of that upbringing, and was very aware of God, but wasn't following God in any strict sense. And I had all of these questions, and my questions were intellectual questions. Yeah, as a teenager, I was very inquisitive. I was kind of already very much into science and maths, and I was asking my mum all of these really hard questions that for me were obstacles. And she didn't know.
A lot of people now will identify with that are watching or listening.
Exactly, yeah. And there are intellectual obstacles that people have, and my mum didn't know the answers.
I can identify with your mum thinking of the questions my kids ask.
Right.
You know, you are challenged.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there are hard questions there to ask. And I was bringing these to my mum, and she wasn't a scientist or an academic, and she didn't know the answers to many of them. But she had the wisdom to go and get me some books. And so she went and like the next week put 3 or 4 books in front of me and said, I hopefully you might find the answers in some of these. And I did.
Was there ones that had a particular influence, or?
I think C.S. Lewis had a huge influence on me.
Mere Christianity?
Mere Christianity, yeah, just an amazing book, yeah. But I found lots of other great books since. But I would say that the one that had the biggest influence on me, the author that's had the biggest influence on me is C.S. Lewis. And even more than Mere Christianity, maybe his book called Miracles, which is, in some sense, his philosophical argument for the supernatural. So it's almost like pre-Christian.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, you know, can we philosophically argue, or even not even just philosophically, just from the evidence, argue that there are some things that are just outside of the provenance of science and outside of the provenance of what we might call the laws of nature. And I found that argument very compelling, for example.
Yeah.
So yeah, my own journey has been exactly that. My own journey has been wrestling with intellectual obstacles, and then finding very satisfactory answers. In fact, more satisfactory in Christianity than I found in any other worldview. So I can completely relate to that journey.
And I think it's one that God wants us to go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like
different obstacles for different people. Obviously, you know, you have the mind of a scientist, a mathematician, but he doesn't want us just to accept blindly. He's
Of course not. Yeah, of course not. I mean, if we assume that God exists, then surely He's big enough to handle our questions, right? Yeah. I mean, if he's real and He exists and he is who He says He is, then He's big enough to handle the biggest questions. He's not afraid of our questioning. Of course He's not. I mean, any more than When my kids bring hard questions to me, of course I want to help them. I want
So
to.
you can get stumped too, still.
Yeah,
Just like
yes,
your mom
and
would be.
yeah, and I do regularly.
What do you say to someone, just finally to ask you, Peter, about someone who's listening to this now and they're in that space where they're saying those obstacles are in front of me. I always feel like, why was I blessed with the right people at the right time who helped me unpack these big questions? Where somebody listening or watching might say, it's just me grappling with my own mind. What's your advice to them to where do they go
Yeah,
next?
I would say be really, really honest, I think is what I would say. I do have a feeling that people have committed to a particular direction, and they only read and listen to things in that particular direction. And I would encourage people not to do that.
Which is really hard not to do nowadays with even
With
compared to when we
algorithms
were
yeah,
teenagers
yeah.
or whatever. It is an echo chamber.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that lack of, well, I like to call it lack of institutional disconfirmation. It's a real problem because if you're only ever hearing things that affirm what you already believe, I think that's a bad place, and you can never really be intellectually honest in that culture. So I would encourage people just to be really intellectually honest. And I know somebody had a big influence on you was Anthony Flew, and there's a man who was so courageous, so courageous.
He was like number one atheist and
Yeah.
wrote this book, There Is No God. Where ultimately he was just following, the evidence, some of the evidences we were talking about. And
Yeah.
he concluded this points to a creator. But he was kind of ostracized by his community.
Yes. Yeah. But I think it just took immense courage though for him to, I think, to turn his back on decades of things that he had helped establish. I mean, he was so important in the community of atheism as an intellectual voice, and framed a lot of the discourse on that side. Like his influence on atheism still resounds today.
Yeah.
And yet, I think for him it was the integrated complexity of life argument, from evolutionary biology, that made him go, well, no, there has to be a prime mover, there has to be a first cause, or none of this makes sense.
It's just too complex.
Yeah. It just can't happen without
Yeah.
a first cause. And when that fact arrested him, he could have just
Left it there.
left it there and kind of went, well, you know what, I'm doing pretty well over here. I'm getting invited to speak all over the world, and I'm admired by millions of atheists around the world for my intellectual prowess. So I think that takes amazing courage and honesty. And I would say that would be a great book for someone to read who's kind of who's on the fence, or somebody who is a genuine, honest explorer of these matters. I think that book you mentioned, I don't know if it's called There Is No God or There Is a
Noah's crossed
because the
out.
no is crossed
Yeah.
out and it's replaced with an A.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a really great book. It would be a really great place to start for someone.
I think we started to scratch the surface on our big question today, but it's been great to have you with us.
My
And
pleasure.
hopefully it's helped some of you. It's gotten the wheels turning. It's been great to have Dr. Peter Taylor with us on The Way today. And thanks for being with us.